Okay, so we already covered grain and how to use that to cut your knit binding strips in the correct direction. A couple more things on cutting your binding. Cut lots of extra. Don't cut it to the exact length. It could take many inches to get it on track and get it flowing right out of the binding attachment, and you'll need a lot of extras for testing. Cut it to the width specified by the binder. Use rotary and a ruler. It's really easy and fast and accurate. You get the hang of it really fast. I mean, you can buy pre-cuts, but I don't ever bother. I'd much rather match the color and just save the expense and cut my own. We talked about grain. Usually you're going to cut it the crosswise grain. Fabric to use. I suggest something that's not too heavy and not too light. I like a spandex like this, just a good quality spandex. Ribbed fabrics and cotton knit ribbed fabrics work well. If a fabric's too light and slippery, sometimes it will not bind well. Sometimes you can salvage that with spray starch. That'll give it enough stiffness to work in the binder, but not always. So it's a good idea to test even before you commit to using a binding on a garment. In other words, don't cut out a tank top and seam it as if you're going to use the apply binding until you've tested to see if that fabric is going to work, because you might use a band or some other finish, or you're going to have to find another binding or something. Not all fabrics will work as binding. Fabric that's too heavy to fit in the binder, if you're having to tug it through, it's probably not going to feed very well. So you want something with a little bit of body, but not too heavy. Fold over elastic, as I said earlier, works great in a single fold binder, and it's a good option. I don't know that it's as durable, as actually using fabric, but it's a good option for a lot of purposes. So we talked about the anatomy of the binders. I spoke a little bit about which binders to buy and use for different machines. I'm not going to be able to cover all the machines. If you aren't sure what binder to get for your machine, post in the group and someone will help you out who knows that machine. I did mention that I don't think the binding attachment that I bought from my Baby Lock Euphoria works that great. The binder itself works great. The problem is the foot. And maybe there is a foot for the Baby Lock that does this, but I didn't see one. I like a binder. Most binders come with a foot. The foot's usually shorter to accommodate the binder being right up against here, so that the end of the presser foot goes right up to where this binding comes out of the attachment here. So usually you have a special presser foot. And when you buy the set for the Janome 1000 CPX anyway on Amazon, you get a base plate you can screw this onto, and you get a foot that's shorter. It has a little lip on the right side. So I like binding with that kind of foot. That's my preference. I don't know if the Erica Sweden ones have a foot like that, but so that's why I really like those attachments for the Janome. That was my favorite way to bind, and I had a Janome dedicated for that until I discovered that I could just binder clip this on, and I decided I like this even better for binding because, like I was explaining, that foot I can adjust where that. I not only have a lip on the foot on the right side to keep that binding corralled and keep it from roping around, but I've got a way to adjust it right to left. So, setting up the binder, we talked a little bit about the various methods already in the last video, but further detail as it's on the machine here. You want, like I say, you want this right up to the tip of the foot, but you want to be able to lift it. You can see it was getting hung up a little there. It moved itself into position. It was still, the foot's not quite going all the way down, so I need to move that back a little. So you're going to need to get your binding attachment set up front to back, so it's just right next to the tip of that foot but not interfering. And then left to right. Now the left to right positioning is going to depend on how wide your binding finish is and your needle position. For this machine, I'll just go middle and right. You're going to have to fiddle that with that, and you can get help in the group if you want, but that's going to depend on your machine. But that's what works for my binding, my setup. So I'm going to make sure I got the right program there. And for that stitch. with this machine. And so also, like I said before, you're going to put the right side of the fabric into the back. And so I'm looking at the wrong side. And I, again, like these biology probes to get it going. Now, before I even put this binder on, I did a test just to make sure the cover stitch was working well. Because if your machine isn't forming a nice cover stitch, it's definitely not going to form a nice cover stitch when you're going through a binder and a bunch of layers. So test that first so that you're not blaming the binder. People say, oh, my binder's not working well. Is the machine cover stitching without the binder? No? Okay, well, blame the binder. Something else going on. You also, and other times, you'll test and the thing is working great. The machine's cover stitching great, and then you put the binding in and it's all of a sudden not. Consider the needle always, because when you bind with this double fold binder, this is 4 layers just of the binding because each layer is folded double. And then when I put my fabric in, that's another layer. And if I go over a seam, that's going to be a few more layers. So definitely going to want a size 14 really sharp needle. You're probably going to want to run your longest stitch length because this is so bulky and there's going to be resistance. You might need to tinker with the differential. Probably going to more likely increase that to increase your pull when you're setting it up. And then you're going to start testing with one of your mega extra strips. Sometimes it's easier to put the binding position and then attach the binder to the machine. I don't know, it just kind of depends. But I can just see, I see that I got it going right against this right edge, the little loop here. And this wanted to get, my binding here wanted to, see it wants to roll. And that's the disadvantage of not using the rake, is this fabric really wants to roll and curl. Again, I could hit it with some spray starch, or I could just fiddle with it until it unrolls and make it behave. So I'm going to have to, since I don't have a rake, I'm going to have to tend this over here with my right hand, which is okay with me. So I'm going to start by just getting the stitching. And it's sometimes, like I say, it takes several inches for that, for the binding to move into position left to right. So you definitely want to give it a chance to do that. And then when you're happy how it is, you take your fabric that's getting bound, and again, I like the probe, and I'm right where it's folding here, right where I watch it folding at the right here. This is so hard being left-handed and not getting in the way. I guess either way, I'm gonna get my hand in the way. But this part right here is where I'm going to put the fabric. This is such a long distance between here. It's like 2 inches between where I stick the fabric in and the needles along foot there. So you have to, accommodate for that. Also have to accommodate for fabric falling off the edge. I've had situations where I do a test and it works great, but then my garment, which might be heavy, that I'm binding the edge of, say I'm binding the edge of a bottom edge of a really heavy fleece jacket or something, and it's going to want to pull out. So if you can support that somehow or do something. So I'm going to keep this fabric right touching this fold as I go in. And I'm just going to really, if it's a curves are trickier because the fabric being bound will want to pull out. And so you really have to sometimes stop and just cram it under there. Make sure it's consistently staying under there. And then, so there's a lot of construction method. Well, not a lot. There's a lot to be said about the 2 different main construction methods with binding, which are basically binding flat or binding in the round. And a lot of different ways you can construct the garment to work for that, but I'm definitely not going to have time. That would be at least another 10-minute video, probably more, so I'm not going to have time to get into that, or joins. But real basically, the advantage of FOE is you can seam it with very little bulk. If you cover stitch the thing flat, you don't have to worry about trying to make a join in the binding, but then you're going to have a bulky seam. If you do it in the round, you have to finish that match somehow. I've been lately just butting the 2 raw edges, zigzagging it, and putting a little heat transfer vinyl over it. But if I'm doing an underarm, that's that's a really easy thing, just to bind flat and then stitch up the seam, because the underarm's, you know, under the arm anyway. So sometimes with t-shirts I prefer a band to binding, because I can get a better join, and I don't like the feel of binding and that bulky join. So there's pluses and minuses, and a lot to be said about various construction methods with binding. That's just a real quick overview. But as you can see, it's really easy to keep it straight. The binding, once you get it set up, and it can take some tinkering, of course, these are cover stitch machines, to get the binder set up, correct direction, front to back, right to left, and to get the binding cut just right. Some people say, oh, cut it a little thicker, a little thinner. I haven't found that normally is helpful. If it's roping or snaking around under there, usually it's just a problem, you know, with the foot itself or the setup. You know, you could try adjusting the presser foot pressure, but usually it's that fabric just isn't going to be very good as a binding. It's too light and slippery maybe. But other than that, once you get it going, it just makes it very easy to keep straight and apply beautiful, and, you know, have a beautiful soft, you can put a nice soft type of woolly thread on that bottom looper. Right here I'm using this it's called Prolux. They actually discontinued it, and it was my favorite. It's been my favorite thread. It's kind of a woolly type. It's soft and stretchy, but not a pain to deal with like woolly nylon. So anyway, you can achieve a really nice effect with using a binding attachment that's going to be soft on the skin, very stretchy, look good, and be super fast once you get the setup. So, and again, in terms of actually getting the binding on, you know, it's all in the prep. You know, once you get the thing attached correctly, it's just a matter of feeding this strip through with the right side and the back, and keeping a handle on the tail here, either using a rake or applying pressure if you want the binding to be a little shorter and gather the fabric a little, like elastic does. You can just give it a little pull. If you want it to be just 1-to-1, you can just, you know, keep the tension off it like that and make sure it doesn't curl with that right hand. And some people make elaborate little systems to roll it off or use the rake, and I don't, but you can. And that's about it. That's about all I know about applying cover stitch binding with a knit binding attachment. Good luck with it. Let us know if you have questions or problems in the group. We'd be happy to help you. Bye.